It's Talking Pints, and I'm joined by Toby Young. Toby, welcome.
Good to see you.
To the programme. Now, back in 2012, I'm going to embarrass him now, I really am. Back in 2012, we met at a party. You seemed to be somewhat overexcited at this party and challenged me to some ridiculous juvenile concept of a drinking contest. And I did say, Toby, I don't think it's a very good idea. Well, in the following week's Spectator, this is what Toby Young wrote. I was bleeding at this point, having fallen and hit my head, though you probably wouldn't have noticed on account of the fact my suit and shirt were liberally covered in red wine. Not a good look for a man approaching his 6th decade. Nigel was his usual dapper self, whereas I was lurching around like an OAP on roller skates. I just thought I'd begin by embarrassing you, that's all. Cheers, nice to see you.
Cheers, mate. Yeah. I think I may know your secret of how, I mean, because we did have, of course, your response to my juvenilia challenging you to a drinking contest was to immediately accept, and you then promptly drank me under the table. But I think I know your secret because I suspect that there isn't really any alcohol in that. I think that's a non-alcoholic beer, and I think you may have been drinking non-alcoholic beverages back in 2012, which is how you drank me under the table. I was drinking
Not true, Toby, not true. And I was actually drinking for January alcohol-free lager, but I'm now drinking the real thing. I got to tell you. Now, Toby, you know, Conservative commentator, activist, campaigner. Before we get to the big things that you've done in your life, let's just get right up to date with what's been happening for the last 2 years, the restriction of our freedom, lockdowns. You felt pretty strongly about this from the start, haven't you?
Yes, I felt pretty strongly about it. I wrote about it back in March 2020. I was one of the first journalists to criticise the lockdown, suggest that it might cause more harm than good, and immediately got monstered, was called a Nazi on Twitter. Some people even called for me to be imprisoned because they thought any dissent at that point from the kind of COVID orthodoxy was dangerous to the public. And because I found it difficult to discuss this in the mainstream media, I set up my own website now called The Daily Skeptic. And it's become a kind of forum, a meeting.
And does that get you round being sort of banned or suspended by Facebook and Twitter and all these people?
Well, Facebook has occasionally flagged posts that we've sent to Facebook from the website as containing misinformation. But actually, when you drill down into it and try and find out what it is they're claiming is misinformation, it's terribly unclear. There's no right of appeal. The whole process is completely opaque and we think completely unfair, but there isn't any way in which you can appeal it, seemingly. Twitter have been a bit more tolerant. YouTube have occasionally taken down my videos. They took down a video discussion I was involved in quite close to the beginning of the first lockdown, and I was able to appeal that by pointing out that the other person in the discussion they were accusing of promoting misinformation about COVID was in fact the recipient of a Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 2014. So when I pointed that out, they put it back up again.
Because you're someone that's never been scared of having rigorous intellectual debate. And I just love this. You know, the fact that you authored a book published in 2001, How to Lose Friends and Alienate People. I mean, you are an agent provocateur, aren't you, by nature?
Well, you know, I don't set out to...
Well, if you write a book with that title, I suggest that you do.
It was a book describing my failure to take Manhattan as a glossy magazine journalist in the mid-90s. But I genuinely thought when I went to New York, I'd soon have, the big apple in the palm of my hand. I was going to be the next kind of journalist to conquer Manhattan, and it all just went horribly wrong. But not intentionally so. It was, and that's why it became it's a comic memoir, because I didn't intend to mess up. Just bad things just started happening to me.
Some Brits work on that side of the pond and some don't. James Corden is the most massive success in America. I don't know why, but he is. I know, but he is, you know.
I think you've translated better in the United States than I have. I mean, you're a bit of a celeb over there.
I've had a lot of fun over there.
Yeah.
A lot of... I've got some quite well-known friends over there, and that's perhaps helped me a little bit, But I mean, the thing that I'm really interested in, Toby, is this whole free speech thing. We've kind of touched on it in the last few minutes. The Free Speech Union, cancel culture, the attempt to rewrite virtually every piece of British history. What are we up against here? I mean, are we actually up against that old virus of Marxism that is coming back to try and destroy our identity, Are we up against just a media and social media dominated by the left? Who's the enemy here?
I think it's multifactorial. I think it's partly the triumph of cultural Marxists, particularly in cultural terms, not political terms. I think it's partly the decline of Christianity, and so something has filled the kind of God-shaped hole left by the ebbing of the Christian tide. And
that's climate change, isn't it?
Well, it was climate change, and then it was conforming with all the COVID nonsense, and now it's the church of woke and wokery. I think often when people ask me this question, I think you're coming at it from the wrong angle. It's not, well, what's happened to erode free speech protections. I think the natural human default position is not to tolerate people who challenge your sacred values, who seem to transgress on what's really important to any community. The natural human impulse is to expel them, to cast them out. And that's happened going down through the ages, and we've seen it happen in various totalitarian societies in the 20th century. That's the natural default human reaction, I think, to dissent. And it takes an enormous amount of work, an enormous amount of history and tradition, customs, institutions to protect free speech. And what we've seen is the erosion, the gradual deterioration of those protections. And so we're just defaulting to our much more naturally intolerant state,
Interesting. I think. I was, I suppose, in a sense, in the forefront of this, because I thought we should leave the European Union, and no one thought we should leave the European Union. And yes, you're sort of cast out. But I thought we'd got past all of that. I thought the point of 2 world wars and huge sacrifice was that we could agree to disagree and do so in a civilized way. You're saying that's really quite a modern thing for mankind?
I think it is fairly modern. I think it's not more than about 200 years old. Okay. And we had a kind of golden period between, the retirement of the Lord Chamberlain as the kind of censor of our theatre in the kind of mid-1960s up until about 5, maybe 10 years ago. A golden period of free speech, and we're now seemingly retreating from that. I mean, I thought free speech was in dire peril in 2020, 2 years ago, almost to the day that I set up the Free Speech Union. Yeah. And I didn't think things could get any worse. But actually, they've got worse by an order of magnitude, partly as a result of the pandemic, which has seen lots of people who dissent from the prevailing narrative cast out, cancelled, silenced, no platformed, and partly as a result of the BLM protests resulting from George Floyd's death. And that has meant that, lots of members of the Free Speech Union have found themselves being cancelled, being targeted, being put through various investigations at work because they've inadvertently said something that has upset BLM activists. If you challenge any element of that analysis, that worldview, you're cast as racist and cancelled.
I found this extraordinary. When the George Floyd thing happened, and within 24 hours there are protests in London. Don't tell me there wasn't a degree of organisation and anticipation of an event that would be used. And because of my time in America, which we touched on earlier, I'd seen BLM. I understood what it was. I knew that it was an avowedly Marxist organisation that wanted to bring down Western capitalism, Western civilization, defunding the police force, anarchist, Marxist, dangerous. I knew all of these things. And that wasn't just my opinion. It was on their blooming website.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yet when I went on TV programmes in this country, it was as if I'd provoked some sort of extraordinary outrage, that logic, fact had gone out of the window with this hysteria. You see, I wonder, Toby, whether the irrationality of what happened over George Floyd, and we all find the way in which he died despicable. That's not in doubt or question or debate. We're not saying any of that. But I've really wondered hard whether this is because our education system is no longer teaching critical thinking. I wouldn't say my school career was particularly distinguished. I didn't go to university, but I was at least taught, whether it was in economics or geography or history or English or those humanity type subjects. I was at least taught from sort of 14, 15, 16, here's a big question, here are 2 fundamental philosophical approaches to dealing with that question. They're radically different. But, you make your own mind up.
Yeah, I don't think it's just that schools and universities, and I think particularly universities, are no longer teaching students, school children, how to think critically, how to evaluate different claims, how to measure them against the evidence. It's they're actively encouraging children and students not to think that way.
Yes.
I mean, for instance, if you dissent from the idea that Britain is systemically racist, that all black Britons are treated as second-class citizens and don't have anything like the same opportunities across multiple fields as white people. If you challenge that idea, if you even claim that we're a less racist society than we were 25 years ago, without saying everything's rosy in the garden, just that things have improved a bit in the past 25 years, that can get you cancelled at most universities across the country. And I know this because the Free Speech Union gets cries for help from students and academics who've challenged precisely that bit of dogma. We get 25 requests for help a week, and we end up helping about half of them, and sometimes we're successful.
And you yourself finished up being cancelled, didn't you?
I did, yeah.
You were moving into a government position, and you'd done some amazing work on free schools. Proud of that. But you were described as misogynistic and homophobic. What had you done, Toby?
It was mainly things I'd said on Twitter, sophomoric, late at night after a couple of glasses of this. And back in, 2010, Twitter was more like WhatsApp. You were speaking to your mates, and it was a bit like banter down the pub.
Thought you were.
Well, so I thought.
Yeah.
And I hadn't realised that this would all be stored, in perpetuity, ready for the offence archaeologist to start sifting through as soon as I was appointed to a government job. I mean, it wasn't a particularly big government job. I was one of 50 non-executive directors of a new university regulator. We're going to meet 4 times a year. It was unpaid.
But it was a big story at the time.
It was the biggest story of the week. I mean, incredibly. Yeah. And that was in the beginning of 2018. I decided naively to apologise and step down from that particular position, thinking that would draw a line under it. But in fact, that was just like throwing red meat to a shoal of piranha fish. And the same outrage mob then came for me in 4 other positions, and I ended up losing 5 positions. I was well and truly cancelled. I even lost my full-time job, couldn't pay the mortgage. And it was partly being in that situation, feeling isolated, not knowing who to turn to for help, for impartial advice, legal advice, career advice. I mean, your career is literally burning to the ground in front of your eyes, and you're panicking. How do I stop this? How do I put it out? And it was the absence of any body to turn to give me that kind of advice and support that was the wellspring of the idea for the Free Speech Union. Yeah. So now, if someone finds themselves in that position, they can reach out to us and we'll give them the kind of help that I really needed back then.
This level of hatred is extraordinary, isn't it?
It is. I mean, the odd thing about it, Nigel, the irony is that the people who are the most vituperative and unpleasant on Twitter think of themselves as the nice guys. If you look at all the trans rights activists that went after J.K. Rowling just because she wants to defend a traditional definition of the word woman, the unbelievable vituperation, the nastiness, the unpleasantness of all that venom directed towards her on Twitter and elsewhere by the people who think of themselves as the nice people in this debate. And it's like they've given themselves licence to be really unpleasant.
The Liberals, who were wholly illiberal.
We saw it during the Brexit debate as well.
No, well, we did. But, through history, Toby, social pendulums swing back and forth, and we've, seen this, and one thinks of perhaps 17th century Britain being a very good example, where we go from, Puritanism to Hogarth's Gin Lane in the space of about 20 years or whatever it is.
Yes.
I'm not saying either are good, by the way, but does this pendulum swing back?
I hope so. It could just be that we're in a particularly puritanical phase, and the cycle will eventually turn the other way. But you're right, things do change. And that's why I think it's so short-sighted of people on the left to be calling for more censorship of things like jokes. The number of progressive left-wing comedians that have actually called for Jimmy Carr to be prosecuted, reported him to the police for this inappropriate joke he told. It was inappropriate, but it was a joke. And the state should not be deciding, what jokes people can tell and what they can't. But the reason this is so short-sighted, Ira Glasser, the legendary ex-head of the American Civil Liberties Union, back when it was a really militant pro-free speech organisation, said the trouble with speech restrictions is they're a bit like poison gas. you're on the battlefield, you've got the enemy in your sights, and it seems like a good idea to release the poison gas. And then the wind changes. And what's so naive, I think, about all these left-wing, progressive, woke activists calling for censorship is that one day, and in the not-too-distant future, it'll be turned against them.
It happened to us the first day of Battle of Loos, 1915. It can happen. These things can go wrong. Finally, Toby, quickly, you know, you're a known Conservative supporter. You've obviously been around Boris Johnson very often through Spectator and everything else, and like him. Is he going to survive?
I think that his chances of fighting the next general election, which I think he'll, will probably be sooner rather than later, particularly if he's there to call it. I think about 2 weeks ago, they were slightly higher than 50%. I think now they're slightly lower than 50%, but I wouldn't place his prospects any lower than that.
OK, well, we'll see. Toby Young, listen, very passionate defence of free speech. I'm horrified by what you were put through, but you're a brave guy, and I wish you and the Free Speech Union well, and thank you for joining me on Talking Pints.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.